Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 74 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. George Washington stands as one of the most famous Americans in history. But what do we know about his helpmeet and partner, Martha? Martha Washington was a strong, business-savvy woman, but when we think about her, we often only do so because we're pairing her with George. So, what could we learn if we looked at Martha on her own terms? Today, we're going to find out, because we're going to focus our weekly exploration of early American history on Martha Washington. Our guide for this investigation is Mary Wigge, a research editor for the Martha Washington Papers Project. During our quest to find out more about Martha, Mary reveals details about the Martha Washington Papers Project, Martha's views on slavery, and why Martha married George Washington and what she thought of his military and political career. But first, are you a member of the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook? I hope you are, because not only is it a fun place to hang out and chat about history and life, but it's also the place where I host the book giveaways. And at the moment, I have a mountain of books to give away. Well, not a literal mountain, but definitely a figurative mountain of books to give away. You can join the listener community by visiting benfranklinsworld.com and clicking on the orange Join Now button on the home screen, or you can text BF World to 33444, and both methods will get you the link to the community. Okay, are you ready to discover more about Martha Washington? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a graduate of the University of Virginia, where she studied history and art history and wrote a thesis on mid-19th century photography. During her career, she has worked on the presidential recordings of Lyndon B. Johnson Digital Edition project and as a development assistant on the Thomas Jefferson Foundation's Monticello. Today, she joins us in her role as a research editor for the Martha Washington Papers Project to discuss Martha Washington. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Mary Wigge.
Hello, I'm delighted to be on the show.
Mary, what does a research editor do, and would you tell us about the Martha Washington Papers Project?
Sure. So as a documentary editor, we search for documents, for letters, then transcribe them and research them extensively, and we provide annotations for the text and an index, and then proofread. We do a great deal of proofreading, and then we publish and make it accessible to the public. And so what our main intention is to make these documents and these letters legible and searchable and available to basically provide the most accurate transcriptions and information. And so we began as the George Washington Papers, and we began in 1968 at the University of Virginia. And just this past summer, we have expanded to include the Martha Washington Papers Project, and we're also going to do the Family Papers Project, and there's also the George Washington Barbados Project. And so we're just going to be focusing more on Martha Washington and the Custis grandchildren, and mostly any of George's siblings.
How big is the Martha Washington Papers Project? How many papers did Martha leave behind?
It's not as extensive as the George Washington Papers, which is over 90,000 documents. But I will say that the first publication of Martha's letters was by Joseph Fields, and it came out in 1991. And he had roughly around 450 letters. And again, as I mentioned, our project started in the summer of 2015, and we've already cataloged at least 650. So though it's going to be a great deal smaller than George, we're definitely finding a good deal more. Not to mention, actually, coincidentally, I found a letter yesterday that a recent publisher, Flora Fraser, notified to us about. It's actually from Kansas, of all places. So it's very exciting.
What was in the letter?
The letter is from Martha to her niece, Fanny Bassett Washington. And Martha's very concerned about Fanny's husband, George Augustine Washington, who's slowly dying from tuberculosis. So the main thing that is noticeable is she's suggesting that perhaps George Augustine should drink breast milk to help with his condition. So she's very, very concerned for his health.
Let's explore the life of Martha Washington. Martha Washington was born Martha Dandridge in 1731. Mary, would you tell us about Martha Washington's early life? What was her childhood like, and what experiences would she have had as the daughter of a well-to-do Virginia planter?
Unfortunately, it's a bit hard for us to know precisely about her childhood because we don't have any letters earlier than around 1759, after the death of her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis. So we can only really make an educated guess. So we know that Martha was the eldest of 8 children, so she was very likely responsible for the caretaking of her younger siblings. She learned a great deal about the household and farm maintenance and family caretaking, all the necessities of a Virginia plantation woman. And for receiving a typical education, she focused on housekeeping and religion and music and probably dancing. And so her family wasn't the most well-to-do family. They couldn't afford private tutors, very likely, or if they did, they may have hired traveling tutors. But we know that she probably received a very basic but solid education in reading, writing, and arithmetic. So we know this because she at some times keeps some account books, especially after the death of her first husband. And in her correspondence, she has a solid writing method, but it is a phonetic spelling that she's using. And essentially, she's really learning the tools of maintaining a farm and a plantation.
Would you tell us about Martha's first marriage to Daniel Parke Custis? Who was Custis and how did the couple meet?
Martha knew Daniel from childhood, really. And so Daniel was a much older, wealthy man who came from the prominent Custis family. And so, they grew up in the same area and they attended the same parish church. But, of course, Martha was around 19 years old, whereas Daniel Parke Custis was 20 years her senior, but he was wooed immediately. This was not the first time that Daniel Parke Custis had tried to marry, and yet he received the disapproval and threat of disinheritance from his father because the prospective bride's family was not as wealthy as he would have liked. So his father, John Custis, is very particular and rather a huge curmudgeon. But after the intervention of some friends and actually meeting Martha face-to-face, the elder Custis gives him his consent. It's said and actually recorded in some correspondence that Martha went and talked to Daniel Parke Custis' father herself and persuaded him to give his blessing to their marriage. So it shows Martha's strength and determination, and again, a particular charm that she had.
Was that typical in the 18th century for a younger woman to marry a man who was 20 years her senior?
Yes, in some cases, yes.
And what was Martha's marriage to Daniel Parke Custis like?
Again, it's hard to officially know because there's not a great deal of correspondence during that time, but they seemed like they were well-to-do, very wealthy couple, and it seemed that they were happy. That is, they had, 4 children together. Now, unfortunately, the first 2 children pass away at early ages, which was also typical, but they have 2 remaining children. There's Jack Parke Custis, and Martha Parke Custis, or Patsy, and I think they were actually a very happy couple, and sadly, Daniel Parke Custis passes away suddenly, and we think it's from heart conditions, leaving her with her 2 very small children.
How did Martha experience widowhood?
She probably grieved a good deal, but she was very strong. There is a letter that she writes to the Robert Carey and Company that expresses that though her husband has passed away, that she is going to be handling these accounts now, and she doesn't want to be played with just because she's a woman, that she wants the fair, accurate, amounts for what she wants shipped, and she doesn't really just want to be used, essentially.
How long was Martha a widow before she met George Washington?
About a year and a half, just about a year, yeah.
And Michael would like to know how Martha Dandridge Custis met George Washington. What did Martha see in George Washington, and why did she agree to marry him?
I actually really like this question. We just recently had a lifetime learning event, and the whole purpose was to kind of reveal that Martha wasn't just living in the shadows of George, that she wasn't just waiting for George to come and choose her and, scoop her away, that she had a choice in the matter. In fact, Martha had many suitors, and one included Charles Carter, who was much older. He was already in his 50s. He had 2 previous wives, and he had over 10 children, but he was extremely, extremely wealthy, and he came from a well-to-do Virginia family. But George had some highlight. He was a well-known colonel at this point, and he had recently acquired Mount Vernon. He was prominent for his heroic actions and tours in the French and Indian War, and he was young. He was just 1 year younger than her. He was extremely tall. He stood I think he was over a foot over Martha's around 5-foot stature, and he's extremely graceful. He was known as an excellent horseman and a dancer and just a natural-born athlete, and he had prospects for a potential future. And though he was kind of in this lower rung of social status, comparably to Charles Carter, and he lived farther away from the area that Martha was familiar with and had grown up with, she saw a man with promise and property and a respectable bearing, and someone who could be responsible and kind and caring for her children.
After Martha married George, how did her life change? She had to move from one area of Virginia that she knew really well to a new area of Virginia to live at Mount Vernon.
That's right, yeah. So she's moving a great deal farther than she's ever traveled. Not to mention, Martha doesn't actually like traveling. So she's living on a new plantation. She's further away from her family than she's ever been. And though house maintenance isn't completely new or foreign to her, this is definitely a new house and new property that she has to become familiar with. And she has new family members, new neighbors that she needs to become acquainted with that she's never met before. And not to mention, though she has these responsibilities, there's now a loss of control of her, maintenance of property. There's a letter from George to the London merchants in around 1759 to the Robert Carey and Company that's noting the transfer of economic responsibility from Martha to George. So he's now acquired a third of the estate through marriage with Martha, and he will be acting as guardian of her Custis children, who would later inherit the remaining 2/3. So Martha, who had previously handled the Custis business affairs and ordering and managing shipment of British goods and supplies for the family, no longer really taking that same role anymore.
You mentioned that Martha needed to become acquainted with a new household. What was that process like? How did elite women like Martha become acquainted with the properties of their new husbands?
I believe mostly that they were bringing in their household slaves from where they were previously located, and they're becoming acquainted with this particular situation, with George's particular slaves and servants, and they're kind of learning from her neighbors, from her family members, what they know about the Washington family, and just what responsibilities that will be required once they arrive there.
Earlier, you mentioned that before she married George Washington, Martha controlled the slaves and land of her deceased husband, Daniel Parke Custis. That means Martha had control of nearly 300 slaves and 17,500 acres of land. Marilyn would like to know what Martha Washington thought about being a slave owner.
Martha lived in an environment of enslavement, and whereas George Washington later encountered a difficulty on the subject of slavery, Martha saw it as a common practice. So she was thought of some, especially those who worked in the household, as kind of part of the family. But at the same time, she had stereotypical views of slaves, as lazy and constantly in need of oversight to do the necessary tasks, especially for one of her slaves named Charlotte, who was a seamstress. And she's constantly writing letters to her niece Fanny that, she needs Charlotte to send one thing after another, and, Charlotte needs constant attention so that she gets all of this work done. So obviously, Martha never really changed her concept of slavery. She just thought it was something that was a common right thing in society.
Would you tell us the story of Oney Judge? Jeannie would like to know more about Oney Judge and Martha Washington's reaction to her escape.
Oney Judge was Martha's maid, a young female slave who Martha was very fond of. And so Martha was actually taken by full surprise when Oney runs away from the executive mansion in Philadelphia. So at this point, George is in his presidency in 1796. And so they are living in Philadelphia. And Oney eventually makes a new life as a free woman, escaping to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So Martha's extremely upset, and she just quite honestly does not understand why Oney would run away. She had seen and thought of Oney as part of kind of almost as close as her family in a way. She was very reliant on her. She thought that Oney enjoyed the pleasures of the city. And so again, she did not really believe that enslavement was something in error, because she had grown up with it and lived with it her whole life. So she just thought of it as an inherent aspect of life.
Did Martha place one of those ads that we've seen in early American newspapers that beseech the public to keep an eye out for her slave with the promise of a financial reward if someone found her?
No, George was in his presidency at this point. It was kind of put under wraps. In fact, George was rather secretive. There's a few letters that he writes when he's, asking essentially certain individuals to go looking for Oney. I can't remember who specifically, but essentially he's asking that, they don't use any force, that they just ask her to return because she really, in a great deal, upset Martha. And, because Martha, again, was just taken for a full surprise. So, yeah, George doesn't put it in any newspaper clippings. He just wants to find her as quickly as possible. Not to mention that they come up with this, idea that she was seduced by a Frenchman, and that's why she ran away. So they're trying to kind of convince her, in person rather than by newspaper post.
I realize our conversation has taken us to George Washington's presidential years, but if we could just take a step back in time for a moment, Nick wonders how Martha handled her relationship with George once he became commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in 1775. Did Martha pine for George while he was away fighting the war?
I'm going to broaden that stage so we kind of just look beyond, how Martha perceived George and see how he felt about Martha during the war. So Martha and George had mutual feelings of concern for one another, as you can see in their correspondence to others, as well as how other letters were written about them. And from what we can gather, Martha was a natural worrywart. She was really fretful of George's state, and as well as concerned about the well-being of all her family members. But we also know that George was worried for Martha. In one of his rare letters to her, and again, there's only two of them that are found that are from George to Martha, it's when he's requested to lead the Continental Army. And he's writing to Martha, and he's trying to provide solace and let her know that he's going to try to see her as soon as possible, at the latest, sometime in the fall. And immediately after sending this letter to Martha, he sends one to her son, Jack Custis, as well as to Martha's brother-in-law, and I think even to one to his own brother. And he's requesting them to visit and keep Martha company while he's away, because he wants her to have some form of solace. And not to mention, every time that George requested that Martha come visit him, which she did, even though she didn't like to travel, he wanted the best in terms of supplies and transport for Martha's visits. So he appreciated that she brought this sense of home and comfort that he couldn't and he wouldn't have until the end of the war. So I think it really strengthened their relationship. And certainly strengthened Martha, because she's traveling, again, as I said, each winter to Washington's winter headquarters. And so for a woman who hardly traveled, she had hardly really seen much of the world. This is quite a new experience. Also, there's a point where she has to get inoculated because smallpox is prominent in the Army camps. And George thinks she's absolutely not going to do it. And so, therefore, she won't be able to come visit me. But she actually steps over that obstacle and she gets inoculated, though she's incredibly fearful. She's very, very scared, that she's going to get sick and it's not going to, successfully go well. She's terrified when her son has to get inoculated. She's basically like, just don't tell me until he's fine and healthy again and, that he's okay. So again, she's witnessing some harsh military conditions. And so I think this is really, for a woman, this is quite something new for her.
It's really difficult to gauge what some relationships and people were like when we lack letters and correspondence to tell us that information. In the absence of letters between George and Martha, it's really helpful to look at their actions towards each other because they provide insight into their marriage. It sounds like Martha's willingness to travel and put up with military life, and George's looking out for Martha to make sure that she had everything that she needed, indicates that this couple really loved and cared for each other.
Oh, yeah. Again, I'd say you're absolutely right on the ball, that it's through their actions that you can see a great deal.
Earlier, we mentioned that Martha had experience handling the affairs of trade for her deceased husband, Daniel Parke Custis. Did the Washingtons take advantage of her knowledge and experience to help keep Mount Vernon running during the war?
She's definitely responsible for the maintenance of the house, as she always has been, and so she's putting in certain requests, but I haven't seen as many letters of correspondence or any account books during that time that she's maintaining herself.
Let's return to Washington's presidency. Fred would like to know what Martha thought about George's election to the presidency and about her new role as First Lady.
So Martha wasn't exactly thrilled. She thought that George had served his public duty as commander-in-chief and rightfully deserved a peaceful retirement. So she knows that, however, after George is inaugurated in 1789, he'll uphold his responsibility. So when she joins him, she feels imprisoned by the limitations and the restrictions of her public station. And not to mention, she just feels lonely. She is very engaging and she does enjoy the social occasions, but she feels like she doesn't really have a moment to herself. Like she's constantly surrounded by people, that she's constantly engaged. She has to have her hair set and particular outfits chosen purposefully. And it's almost kind of like making a fashion statement as it's done today. But you can tell, and she even writes in some of her letters to her niece that she wishes she was closer to her family members at home rather than amongst strangers. So there's a sense that she's homesick and she feels limited by her actions or what she can do or who she can see.
Did Martha establish any traditions that First Ladies still follow today?
As I mentioned, she was very personable and she enjoyed social occasions. She was expected to be hostess for 2 weekly social gatherings. One was on Friday evening, and it was a rather relaxed, enjoyable invitation to both men and women. And they were just, they would be invited to the drawing room and they could discuss topics of the day. And then there was the Thursday dinner parties that were to host official guests, usually cabinet members, senators, congressmen, foreign dignitaries. And as I mentioned, so she has particular fashion statements that she wouldn't necessarily have probably done herself, but, she's definitely wearing certain more American-made apparel, and kind of like in today's society, first ladies usually, like any celebrity, kind of set the role and tone for, the fashion statement. Not to mention some of the food and her china set that she's using in these social gatherings is rather important, and definitely more so through history. Many people seem to be very curious, what she served and how she served them. And so you can tell that both George and Martha, in a way, is trying to maintain this dignified but respectable and rather modest tone for the first presidency.
Couples who spent a lot of time apart during the Revolution, like John and Abigail Adams, left behind many letters, and those letters are great because they shed light upon their relationships, news of the day, politics. But Howard would like to know why so few letters between George and Martha Washington remain.
Unfortunately, for us, we're especially saddened that there's so few letters. But basically, after George's death, Martha burns their correspondence. And this was rather a common practice, but she also just very likely wanted to conceal their privacy. But there are two letters from George that I mentioned earlier that still exist, and he writes them when he first takes command of the Continental Army. And there are two letters from Martha to George. And of course, this again leaves a great room for speculation and leaves a great deal of questions, like their marriage, like was it a love match or just a union of companionship, or was it just a marriage of convenience? But as you mentioned earlier, you can see a great deal through their actions rather than through their words. But also, in the few letters that they do have to one another, they begin these letters with, "My dearest." There's one letter that she's writing to George. It's written in 1769, so that's about a decade after their marriage, and she starts with "My dearest," which is just so sincere and rather loving. And when he writes a letter, in 1775, he starts it with the same phrase. So you can tell that there's some deal of affection that they have for one another. But not to mention, from what we've gathered by looking at how Martha, references George, or how George references Martha in correspondence to others, or, how others just observe them just as a couple, you can tell and notice that they were greatly fond of one another and that there was a great deal of affection, especially over the years.
How does the absence of letters between George and Martha affect your work at the Martha Washington Papers Project?
For us, it is difficult, essentially because we are constantly encouraged and enthusiastic that we might find more information about them. If not, we are constantly hoping for the day that we will find another letter from George to Martha or vice versa, that we'll find a new letter. As I mentioned earlier, just yesterday we discovered a new letter from Martha to her niece Fanny, that maybe we'll find another letter that makes some mention of prominence, of Martha discussing a great deal about George, or, George mentioning something of importance in Martha's life that has occurred in another letter. So we are just very hopeful that we will find this information, but until then, we are just constantly looking, and really our research is then focused on finding how others reference George and Martha and their relationship.
Are you also hopeful that you might find a letter from Martha to George discussing politics, or was that just a topic they wouldn't have discussed?
I don't quite think that's something they would discuss, especially in their private correspondence. She was a form of solace and comfort for him, and I think she helped ease his mind so that he wouldn't have to think on business affairs. Not to mention, in her correspondence with some of her female friends and her female family relatives, she doesn't really bring up politics a great deal.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
And Mary, today, we want to know what would have happened if Martha Washington had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if Martha Dandridge Custis had rebuffed George Washington? What do you think her future and life would have been like had she not married Washington?
Well, I think Martha, she was a hot commodity. She was a young, attractive, very wealthy widow. And so she has two very young children. And so I would imagine she would have married another suitor. If not Charles Carter, perhaps someone else who she felt she could trust to be financially stable and responsible and rely on for, maintaining, her livelihood and her children's. But on the on the other side of the coin, I think George's life would have been greatly affected if he had not met Martha, and certainly without the Custis fortune. He may not have had the same political prominence and stature, and if he had risen to the same degree, he would have possibly had a different style of commanding. Because, Martha definitely helped lighten the tension and stresses of the war and the presidency for him. As I mentioned, she was a great deal of a comfort to him and just helped provide kind of a form of peace. And from their correspondence with others, there's a sense that there was a partnership. Their marriage was more mutual sense of affection and understanding, and they shared the responsibilities necessary to keep basically their relationship alive, because their marriage was a partnership that both of them relied on. So I think basically her contributions to him, indirect and direct, would have altered his path as much as he would have altered hers.
Do you see any scenario in which Martha rebuffs all of her suitors and just continues to manage the estate of her late husband?
I think she was a bit too traditional for that. So I don't see that, no.
Before we conclude, would you tell us about what the Martha Washington Papers project is working on now and whether you have any exciting volumes or events coming up?
My coworkers are currently working on George's Barbados diary, which is very exciting. They just completed the transcription phase and are moving on towards annotation. But in terms of Martha, we're just constantly still in the search for more letters, more correspondence, and we're trying to focus more on some of these specific and primary correspondence, which includes Fanny Bassett Washington, her niece. It's very interesting, but we have a great deal of correspondence from Martha to Fanny. However, I have not come across one letter from Fanny to Martha. We are very perplexed by this, and we are still constantly in search. And I'm personally just going to start doing a great deal more research on Fanny and trying to find out more information on her and what she was like, because we can tell that Martha was very reliant on her, especially during the presidency when she asks Fanny and Fanny's husband, George Augustine Washington, to maintain Mount Vernon while Martha and George are away.
Do you have any digital editions that we can access online?
Yes, absolutely. So you can visit and find out more information about us at the gwpapers.virginia.edu, and you'll find more about our projects, and definitely will lead to our digital edition and our comprehensive index.
And for those of us who would like to know more information about Martha Washington, do you have any books you could suggest, books or articles that we could read?
Sure, absolutely. There is Pat Brady's Martha Washington, An American Life. Also, Flora Fraser just published her recent The Washingtons, Joined by Friendship, Crowned by Love.
Mary Wigge, thank you so much for talking to us about Martha Washington and showing us more about her life.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to join. It was my pleasure.
Historians often rely on personal correspondence, diaries, and journal entries to better understand the people they research. Personal, first-hand accounts are invaluable, but what do you do when you lack these resources? As Mary revealed, this is a situation that the editors at the Martha Washington Papers Project face every day. How do they get to know more about Martha, and how can they reveal more about her life when she left so little behind? Fortunately, Mary and her colleagues have found a back door into Martha's life. They are looking at the correspondence and papers of those who would have been in Martha's social and familial circles to see what they said about her. This is a technique that many historians use, either when they don't have enough firsthand information about a person, or when they want to verify the firsthand information that a person they're studying left behind. You can find more information about the Martha Washington Papers Project, plus the book titles that Mary recommended, on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/074. If you're a fan of the show, which clearly you must be if you're still listening, please consider telling your friends, family, and the person you sit next to on your next bus, train, or airplane ride about Ben Franklin's World. Word of mouth recommendations are the best way for a podcast like this one to find new listeners. And if the people you tell about the show still don't know what a podcast is, Perhaps you could show them and tell them how they could subscribe to a show like Ben Franklin's World, either through one of the major podcast apps, or you could help them by downloading the free Ben Franklin's World app right on their mobile device. Finally, what surprised you most, or what did you find most interesting about Martha Washington? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page, or in the listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.